Okay, let's talk about Guatemala. Specifically, Guatemala in the first half of the 20th century. Now you might picture a beautiful country with a rich history and you'd be right. But for a long time it was also something else, a banana republic. And no, that's not just a clothing store where you can buy slightly overpriced chinos. It was a place where one single American company had so much power, it basically ran the show. That company was the United Fruit Company, which you probably know today as Chiquita Brands International. Yes, the company with the catchy jingle and the lady with the fruit hat. It turns out their backstory is a little less fruity. Imagine a company so dominant that it owned nearly half of all the usable land in an entire country. That was United Fruit in Guatemala. They didn't just grow bananas, they controlled the nation's telephone and telegraph systems, owned almost all of the railroad tracks, and operated the only major port on the Atlantic coast. This wasn't just a business, it was a shadow government that paid almost no taxes. The actual government, led for many years by a ruthless dictator named Jorge Ubico, was more than happy to play along. He kept the people in line, and United Fruit kept the dollars flowing, mostly into their own pockets, of course. This arrangement was fantastic for United Fruit and its American shareholders, but for the average Guatemalan, it was a raw deal. Most of the population, especially the indigenous Mayan people, were landless laborers. They worked long, grueling hours on the plantations for pitiful wages, with few rights and even fewer opportunities. The country's immense wealth, which came directly from its fertile soil, was being shipped abroad, leaving the people who worked that soil in a state of perpetual poverty. This system wasn't an accident, it was a carefully maintained machine designed to extract maximum profit, and it worked perfectly for decades. So, to recap, we have a Central American nation that is, for all intents and purposes, the personal property of a Boston-based fruit company. The company controls the land, the infrastructure and the communication lines. The local dictator is on their payroll, ensuring that the labor force remains cheap and compliant. The vast majority of the population is trapped in a cycle of poverty, watching the riches of their own country sail away on company-owned ships. This was the status quo, and in the 1950s, when someone finally tried to change it, the company and its powerful friends in Washington decided that simply would not do. Then, something remarkable happened. In 1944, the people of Guatemala had enough. A popular uprising, now known as the Guatemalan Revolution, forced the dictator Jorge Ubico to flee the country. It was like the end of a movie, except it was real life. For the first time in its history, Guatemala held a truly democratic election. This period is often called the 10 Years of Spring, a brief but beautiful moment when it seemed like a better future was possible. The new government introduced a new constitution, guaranteed freedom of the speech and press, and allowed labor unions to form. It was a radical idea for a country that had been under an iron fist for so long. Following this wave of reform, a man named Jacobo Árbenz was democratically elected president in 1951. Arbenz was a former military officer, but he was also a progressive reformer. He looked at his country and saw the fundamental problem. A tiny elite and a foreign company owned almost all the land, while the vast majority of his people had none. His big idea, the centerpiece of his presidency, was a land reform law called Decree 900. The plan was simple and frankly quite reasonable. The government would buy up large, uncultivated tracts of land from the big landowners and redistribute it to poor, landless families. Now here's the clever part of Decree 900. To be fair, the government offered to pay for the land they were taking, and how did they determine the price? They used the value that the landowners themselves had declared on their tax forms. This is where the United Fruit Company got a taste of its own medicine. For years, the company had been systematically undervaluing its massive land holdings to avoid paying taxes to Guatemala. So when Arbenz's government came knocking, they offered to pay exactly what United Fruit had claimed the land was worth. Suddenly, the company that had been cheating the system was being held to its own ridiculously low numbers. By the end of 1952, this program was a huge success for the Guatemalan people. Over 100,000 landless families received plots of their own. The government had reclaimed a massive 40% of United Fruit's land, specifically the vast portions that the company was just sitting on, not even using to grow bananas. For the first time, regular Guatemalans had a stake in their own country. They could grow their own food, build their own homes, and imagine a life beyond backbreaking labor for a foreign corporation. But while it was a moment of hope for them, back in the United States, the alarm bells at United Fruit's headquarters were ringing off the hook. Faced with losing a huge chunk of its most valuable tax-dodging asset, the United Fruit Company didn't just take it on the chin. Instead, they launched one of the most effective and dishonest public relations campaigns in history. They knew they couldn't just go to the American public and say, "Help us, a democratic government is making us pay for land at the same value we use to avoid taxes." That's not a very sympathetic argument. So they chose a much scarier, much more effective weapon, the Cold War. They decided to paint President Arbenz and his government not as reformers, but as dangerous Soviet-backed communists. The company hired a man named Edward Bernays, who is often called the father of public relations, which is a bit like being called the father of tricking people for money. Bernays was a genius at manipulating public opinion. He arranged for influential American journalists to take carefully managed trips to Guatemala. On these fact-finding tours, they were fed a steady diet of anti-Arbenz propaganda, warned of a creeping red menace, and introduced to conservative figures who claimed that Soviet agents were hiding behind every corner. These journalists then went home and wrote terrifying articles about a communist beachhead being established in America's backyard. This narrative was incredibly effective because it tapped into the deep-seated paranoia of the McCarthy era in the United States. In the 1950s, Americans saw communism as an existential threat, a monolithic evil that was actively trying to destroy their way of life. The idea that this threat could be taking root so close to home was genuinely frightening. United Fruit's PR campaign cleverly framed Arbenz's land reform not as an economic policy to help his own people, but as the first step in a Soviet plot to take over Central America. They completely ignored the fact that Arbenz was a democratically elected leader, and that his policies were homegrown solutions to Guatemala's problems. The truth was, Arbenz's government was not communist. Yes, the small legal Guatemalan Communist Party supported his reforms, but they held only a handful of seats in the government and had no real power. Arbenz himself was a capitalist who believed in private property. He just wanted that property to be distributed more fairly. But facts didn't matter. The narrative was set. United Fruit had successfully transformed a business dispute over land into a geopolitical crisis. They had convinced key people in Washington that Guatemala was a domino about to fall, and that if it fell, the rest of Latin America might fall with it. Now, you might be thinking, surely the US government could see through a PR campaign from a banana company, right? Well, that's where things get really shady. It just so happened that the United Fruit Company didn't just have friends in the media, they had powerful, well-placed friends at the very top of the US government. The connections were so blatant, it's almost comical. It was less of a government, and more of a United Fruit Alumni Association that just happened to be running the most powerful country on earth. Let's start with the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. His law firm, Sullivan & Cromwell, had represented United Fruit for decades. He had personally negotiated deals that were incredibly favorable to the company. So, the man in charge of America's foreign policy had a long and profitable history with the very company crying foul about Guatemala. It's like having the fox not just guard the hen house but also serve as the judge and jury when a chicken goes missing. It's a massive, glaring conflict of interest that nobody seemed to mind at the time. But wait, there's more. The director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was none other than Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles's brother. Allen Dulles had also done legal work for United Fruit and had even sat on its board of directors. So the head of America's spy agency, the man who would be tasked with any covert operations, had a direct personal and financial link to the company that wanted Guatemala's government overthrown. You couldn't write this in a spy novel because the editor would say it's too unbelievable. The two brothers in charge of diplomacy and espionage were both deeply connected to the banana company. And the connections didn't stop there. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, the guy directly responsible for Latin American policy, had family ties to United Fruit's founders. Even President Eisenhower's personal secretary, Ann Whitman, was married to United Fruit's public relations director. The halls of power in Washington were essentially an echo chamber for the company's interests. When United Fruit whispered communism, These powerful figures heard it loud and clear, not just as a geopolitical threat, but as a threat to their friends, their former clients, and their entire worldview. With the fear of communism firmly planted and the key players in place, President Eisenhower gave the green light. In August of 1953, he authorized the CIA to develop a plan to get rid of President Arbenz. The operation was given the code name PBSuccess. The PB likely stood for Purifoy and Bernays, two key figures, but the success part showed just how confident they were. The stated goal was chillingly direct: to remove covertly the menace of the present communist-controlled government of Guatemala. The budget was in the millions, a huge sum for a secret operation at the time. The CIA was officially in the business of overthrowing a democratically elected government. The plan wasn't to launch a full-scale American invasion, that would be too obvious and politically messy. Instead, the CIA devised a multi-pronged strategy that relied heavily on deception, psychological warfare, and plausible deniability. The first step was to find a Guatemalan face for the coup. They needed a local leader who could be presented as a liberator saving his country from communism. They found their man in Carlos Castillo Armas, a disgruntled Guatemalan army colonel who had been exiled after a failed uprising years earlier. The CIA set him up in neighboring Honduras, gave him money, weapons, and began training a small rebel army of a few hundred mercenaries. The military component, however, was almost a sideshow. The real heart of Operation PBSuccess was a massive psychological warfare campaign. The CIA understood that they didn't need to defeat the Guatemalan army, they just needed to convince the army and the Guatemalan people that defeat was inevitable. They planned to create an illusion of a massive popular uprising that was sweeping the country. The goal was to create fear, confusion, and paranoia, to make President Arbenz feel isolated and powerless, and to persuade his military commanders that resisting the invasion was a suicidal act. To achieve this, the CIA planned to use a combination of cutting-edge and classic espionage tactics. They would set up a secret radio station to broadcast propaganda into Guatemala. They would recruit spies within the Guatemalan government and military to spread rumors and sabotage morale from the inside. They would use a small force of American-piloted planes to conduct targeted bombing raids, designed more to create terror than to cause actual military damage. The entire operation was a carefully choreographed piece of political theater, designed to make a tiny, CIA-funded rebellion look like an unstoppable revolution. It was a blueprint for a new kind of warfare, fought not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the people. On June 18, 1954, Operation PBSuccess went live. Castillo Armas and his tiny army of about 400 men crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala. From a military standpoint, it was honestly a joke. The Guatemalan army was thousands strong and could have crushed this small band of rebels with ease. But, the invasion itself wasn't really the main event. The real attack was coming through the airwaves. The CIA had set up a clandestine radio station called the Voice of Liberation. It was honestly a masterpiece of deception, designed to sound like it was being broadcast by brave rebels from deep within the Guatemalan jungle. In reality, it was broadcasting from Miami. The Voice of Liberation was on the air 24/7, spewing a constant stream of propaganda and lies. It jammed official government radio stations, making sure its message was the only one a lot of people could hear. The broadcasts reported on phantom battles and glorious victories for the rebel forces. They announced that huge columns of freedom fighters were converging on the capital from all directions. They even read the names of prominent citizens who had supposedly joined the liberation, stirring up suspicion and betrayal. It was a ghost army, conjured out of thin air by radio waves, and honestly, it was terrifyingly effective. To back up the radio lies, the CIA deployed its small air force. American pilots hired as mercenaries flew unmarked P-47 Thunderbolt planes over Guatemala City and other key towns. They didn't drop a lot of bombs, but they didn't really need to. Their mission was to create panic. Sometimes they would drop Coca-Cola bottles which made a whistling sound like a bomb as they fell, just to scare people. They bombed a government-owned oil tanker in the harbor and strafed military barracks. The goal was to make it seem like the rebels had air superiority and that a full-scale assault was right around the corner. For the average citizen or soldier on the ground, hearing the radio reports of a massive army and then seeing planes attack the capital, the lie felt very, very real. This psychological blitz had a devastating effect on morale. President Arbenz's government tried to tell the people the truth, that the invasion was tiny and backed by a foreign power, but their message was just drowned out by the CIA's propaganda machine. Arbenz's military commanders grew hesitant. They were hearing about a massive rebel force and seeing bombs fall on the capital. Were they being led into a trap? Was resistance even worth it? The CIA's spies inside the military fed these fears, whispering that Arbenz was planning to arm civilian militias and replace the army. The generals began to believe that siding with Arbenz was a losing bet. The psychological war was working exactly as planned. As the psychological pressure mounted, President Arbenz grew increasingly isolated. He saw his military command wavering, paralyzed by the CIA's campaign of fear and misinformation. In a desperate move, he tried to arm the people. He ordered weapons to be distributed to peasant and worker militias who were loyal to him and his reforms. He believed that if the army wouldn't fight, the people would. However, this move backfired catastrophically. The plan was sabotaged by spies within the military, and very few weapons actually reached the civilians. More importantly, it confirmed the worst fears of his army officers. The generals, already spooked by the CIA's propaganda, saw the attempt to arm civilians as a direct threat to their power and prestige. They feared Arbenz was creating a private army to make them obsolete, just as the voice of liberation had been telling them. This was the final push they needed. Instead of defending their country from the tiny invading force, they turned on their own president. A delegation of senior officers went to Arbenz and delivered an ultimatum: resign, or they would make a deal with Castillo Armas and fight against him. They had completely bought into the CIA's manufactured reality. Trapped and betrayed, Jacobo Árbenz had no choice. His army wouldn't fight for him, the international community was silent, and the psychological weight of the coup had become unbearable. On June 27, 1954, just 9 days after the invasion began, a defeated President Arbenz went on national radio and announced his resignation. He condemned the United Fruit Company and the United States government, explaining that he was stepping down to avoid a bloody civil war. He sought asylum in the Mexican embassy and soon fled the country, never to return. The democratically elected government of Guatemala had been toppled without a single major battle. With Arbenz gone, the CIA's chosen man, Carlos Castillo Armas, marched triumphantly into Guatemala City. He was installed as the new president, the leader of a military junta. The American ambassador, who had been instrumental in the coup, stood proudly by his side. Operation PBSuccess was complete. The CIA had successfully overthrown a sovereign government using a handful of mercenaries, a radio station, and a few old planes. They had proven that the truth was no match for a well-told lie, especially when that lie was backed by the full power of the United States. For the CIA, it was a stunning victory. For Guatemala, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The moment Castillo Armas took power, Guatemala's 10 years of spring came to an abrupt and brutal end. The first order of business for the new regime was to undo every single progressive reform that had been made. The Democratic Constitution of 1945 was immediately abolished. Decree 900, the land reform law that had given hope to so many, was repealed. All the land that had been distributed to poor families was taken back and returned to the United Fruit Company and other large landowners. The company got its land back, its tax breaks restored, and its control over the country cemented once again. The political crackdown was swift and merciless. Castillo Armas rounded up and arrested tens of thousands of people suspected of having supported the Arbenz government. Labor leaders, student activists, intellectuals, and political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or simply disappeared. All political parties were banned and labor unions were crushed. Democracy was dead. In its place was a repressive military dictatorship fully supplied and supported by the United States, which hailed the coup as a great victory against communism. The country was plunged back into a darkness far worse than the one it had escaped in 1944. The coup didn't just end democracy, it planted the seeds for one of the longest and bloodiest civil wars in modern history. Leftist rebel groups inspired by the injustice of the coup rose up to fight against the US-backed military government. This conflict raged from 1960 to 1996. For 36 years, Guatemala was torn apart by violence. The government, with training and equipment from the United States, launched brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. These campaigns often targeted not just armed rebels, but entire communities of indigenous Mayan people who were suspected of sympathizing with them. What followed was a genocide. The Guatemalan military enacted a scorched earth policy, wiping entire villages off the map. An estimated 200,000 people, the vast majority of them unarmed Mayan civilians, were killed or disappeared. A United Nations-sponsored Truth Commission in 1999 concluded that the Guatemalan state was responsible for over 90% of the human rights violations during the war. The commission also stated that the U.S. training of Guatemalan officers in counterinsurgency techniques had a significant bearing on the human rights violations. The coup that was supposed to save Guatemala from a phantom threat had, in reality, pushed it into decades of real, unimaginable horror. So, why are we talking about a coup that happened in a small Central American country over 70 years ago? Because the story of Operation PBSuccess is more than just a history lesson. It's a cautionary tale that echoes through to the present day, June 16, 2025. It serves as a stark blueprint for how powerful corporate interests can merge with government power to subvert democracy for the sake of profit. The unholy alliance between United Fruit and the Dulles brothers set a dangerous precedent, showing how easily foreign policy can be hijacked by private greed, disguised as national security. The coup's legacy in Guatemala is a deep and painful scar that has never fully healed. The 36-year civil war it triggered left the country traumatized and fractured. It destroyed the nation's democratic institutions and created a culture of violence and impunity that persists today. Guatemala still struggles with extreme poverty, inequality, and political corruption, the very same problems that Arbenz tried to solve. The coup didn't just remove a president, it stole a future from the Guatemalan people, derailing their path toward a more just and equitable society and leaving them with decades of pain and instability. Furthermore, Operation PBSuccess became a model for future CIA interventions across the globe. The tactics of psychological warfare, of funding proxy forces, and of creating a false narrative to justify intervention were honed in Guatemala. This playbook would be used again and again in places like Iran, Cuba, Chile, and Nicaragua, often with similarly disastrous long-term consequences. It cemented a pattern of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America that viewed the region not as a collection of sovereign nations, but as a backyard where democratic outcomes were only acceptable if they aligned with U.S. economic and geopolitical interests. Finally, this story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own governments and the information we receive. It reminds us that the official story is not always the true story. A government swayed by powerful lobbyists and corporate interests can manufacture a crisis and sell it to the public. It shows how the fear of a foreign ideology can be weaponized to crush a popular democratic movement. The ghost of Operation PBSuccess lingers as a warning that democracy is fragile, that truth can be manipulated, and that a thirst for bananas or oil or any other resource can be a more powerful motivator for war than any political ideal.